Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International Podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariashin. Thank you for tuning in today. Recently, the United Nations General Assembly's Fourth Committee voted to move forward with renewing the mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, known as UNRWA. Founded in 1949, UNRWA has a long history of supporting anti-Israel incitement. Here to discuss what the renewal of UNRWA's mandate means for Israel is today's guest, Dr. Asaf Romirowsky. Dr. Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and a Fellow in the Middle East Forum. He has co-authored a book with Alexander Joffe on the issue of Palestinian refugees aid titled Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief, published in 2013. In addition, his work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and the Times of Israel, among other media outlets. Dr. Romirowsky is also a professor at the University of Haifa, and he has published widely on various aspects of the Israeli-Arab conflict and Zionist history. Welcome again to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So let's begin really at the beginning. Before we talk about the issues that I've raised in the introduction and a couple of other points later on, let's talk about UNRWA just to go over the founding, why it was founded, and how it somehow wound up where it is today, somewhere off the rails of the original mandate and the original directive set down now 70 years ago.
Right. So, again, thank you for having me. UNRWA's original mandate, and this was American foreign policy in the Middle East in the 1950s and 60s, had to do with the fact that refugees should be resettled, reintegrated, and repatriated, with the idea of providing individuals with skill sets to move on beyond their refugee status. What UNRWA has become, correctly as you stated, is basically become the gatekeeper of a stasis of maintaining Arab Palestinians in refugee status as a result of a political calculus made by the Arab world. And this goes back, for your listeners to understand the historical connection, to the War of 1948-1949 as it relates to Israel's War of Independence. The understanding was, and has been within the Arab narrative, and especially the Arab Palestinian narrative, is that 1948 is considered to be the original sin of Israel's creation, and the consistent reminder of that sinful act, that is Israel's coming to fruition, are indeed the Arab Palestinian refugees. To that end, Arab Palestinian refugees are uniquely defined like no other refugee population. They are, and I paraphrase here, anybody who was born in mandatory Palestine between 1946 and 1948, and the kicker is, of course, their descendants. The ability of lineage, which no population has been given to the Palestinian refugees. And so when you look at the amount, or the so-called amount of Arab Palestinian refugees today, that is a result of this unique definition of who they are. So today, UNRWA claims they have on the books between 5 to 6 million refugees. Where they all come from, that's part of this architecture that was defined by UNRWA. The other unique ability that UNRWA had, and really played into UNRWA's advantage, is that UNRWA was created as a so-called temporary organization, temporary that has no end, as we can see here 7 decades later. But UNRWA was also created prior to the sister organization of refugees, UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which deals with refugees worldwide. So as a result of them being created before, they were also able to define and redefine what they are and what they do. Moreover, they are an Article 22 agency of the General Assembly. Article 22 agencies have little to no oversight by the General Assembly, and they're based on voluntary contributions. And so they've been able to maintain this architecture financially, politically, and culturally.
So like many other agencies of the UN, once they're on the books, it's pretty hard to move, either to close them down or to reform them. UNRWA has what we would call a bloated bureaucracy. So how did it over the years just continue to grow and grow to the point where today, and I'd like you to comment on this, there have been some serious allegations beyond the anti-Israel activity and behavior of the organization, serious allegations of corruption.
Yes. So what you have is, this is part of related to your question. UNRWA today has become, and has been over the years, the largest employer of Palestinians. And so what that does is you have this, what I would consider to be a hijacking of the agency which they claim to take care of. And so there's kind of what I would call, in marketing, regulatory capture, where basically the constituency that they claim to serve has basically taken over for lack of a better term, the asylum, the inmates are running the asylum. What you have is this environment where UNRWA has, and so the international component is really the smaller component. But in the tone of employees, we're talking about 30,000 employees that are all UNRWA employees and are all Palestinians who are maintaining this narrative. The international component, which all the international the CEOs and the administration that have been that are not Palestinians, they have been bought into this architecture and this narrative. And to a large extent, one of the symptoms that we're seeing today is in a use and abuse of the constituency in the tone of billions and billions of dollars, which UNRWA has been receiving over the years from countries, not only the Arab world, but from the West, up until the Trump administration froze the contributions that the United States would give. We were the largest Western contributor in the tone of $400 million a year. And so we've seen now a recent report that has come out, ironically published by Al Jazeera, an ethics report, that deals with the level of corruption, abuse of funds by the former CEO that has been going around and abusing money. And there was a question about a relationship that he had that was beyond professional with one of his aides, and using funds to send her around the world on first-class tickets, but also the whole level of abuse of funds based on the image of refugees who really need aid. And so there's a disconnect between the lives that the officials have been living, or the executive branch of UNRWA, and the constituency they claim to serve. That has caused a great deal of puncturing UNRWA's image in the eyes of the West, and even, and I would say positively, even in the eyes of Europe. The former, the now ousted CEO, the Executive Secretary General of UNRWA, Pierre Kerbel, has been ousted, and the country, as a Swiss citizen, the Swiss now have decided to freeze their monies to UNRWA as a result of the embarrassment it has caused them. So you're seeing a lot of, an eye-opening to what actually is happening on the ground. And this is, again, something that I think, needs to be looked at, vis-a-vis the fact that really, who are the constituents? What is actually happening on the ground? There has not been a real, there's been quasi-needs assessments, but when audit reports have looked at actually what UNRWA does, you really don't get a clear answer. UNRWA has refused outside auditors. They do internal audits. And so it's really hard to get a sense of what are they actually doing, how many laptops, how many pencils they've bought. Much of the service that they provide is education. They have a monopoly over a lot of the educational system within the Palestinian areas. And so it's really hard to get a real clear needs assessment of what are they actually serving and what are the actual needs are. And these latest events have caused the West in particular to wake up and say, really, what are we actually supporting, and what's the end game here? Which I think is something that myself and many of my colleagues who've been involved in the UNRWA space have been arguing and criticizing UNRWA for years.
Well, it is noteworthy that for years, from the get-go, the educational component of UNRWA has been anti-Israel, and that's not raised eyebrows over the years. In recent years, with the Gaza wars, the use of UNRWA facilities by Hamas and others in Gaza to store weapons or even perhaps to fire. We've seen evidence of that, to fire rockets and weapons from near UNRWA facilities. I mean, all of that has been raised, much of it in our own community, but within the UN system or in the international system, hardly really any kind of attention. Now comes the corruption charges, and you mentioned the Swiss pulling back on their assistance. Have there been any other examples of countries that now, seeing at least the corruption charges, have decided to take another look at this and also to cut their funding beyond the United States, let's say, and Switzerland?
The Netherlands have made some comments about this as well, and you're seeing some other countries kind of looking carefully exactly about what UNRWA does. It's not been a full change within the architecture. There's still a belief that if we're saving refugees and refugees are in need, we need to help them. But I think the fact that the Swiss and the Netherlands are waking up to exactly looking at where their money is going and what exactly are they funding, I think that's a beginning to puncture the architecture of UNRWA monies, in the sense that it's not easy for them. I mean, they've been claiming for a long time now, since we froze our money in the United States, that they are in dire needs, the needs are great, and give us more money. Then these allegations come about, and then people were saying, really? I mean, the fact is that you're not even taking care of your own people, but you're actually just helping to only fund your execs and the upper echelon of UNRWA's administration. I mean, I would like to see a trickle-down effect. You're starting to see that happening, given the fact that it was a clear embarrassment to the Europeans, especially to the Swiss, that one of their own, who had taken on this humanitarian initiative, which was supposed to be something that is something to be proud of, the level of abuse that has taken place. By the way, you should also note that, of course, he's denying any of the allegations, and he did leave, but in a storm. And this is continuing on. They have still, the airing of the dirty laundry on UNRWA is something that you're starting to see take a ripple effect. But not in mass. I mean, again, I think that, obviously we can go into that a little bit more. The fact that UNRWA's mandate was now renewed, tells you that people still believe that they are the number one issue and the number one victim of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, the conflict, and as a result of that, we need to continue supporting this organization to no end.
Well, that's really the question. If I understand correctly, I think 170 countries voted for renewing the mandate. And this is in the face of the corruption allegations, not to mention, again, all the other activity, the anti-Israel activity. Why wouldn't the numbers be less in the face, particularly in the face of these corruption charges?
You would think, but again, I think that part of the symbolism that plays into the refugee, the word refugee connotes people fleeing for their lives. They live in refugee camps, the fact that they have no running water. I think people think, about the imagery of Sudan or somewhere in Africa, that, that the resources are not there. That is not the reality on the ground as it relates to the so-called refugee camps, as it relates to the Arab Palestinians. But the imagery has created this cognitive dissonance as it relates to why people support this. And the fact that there are people going around the world, and you can find quotes from Arab leaders going back to Nasser, and even going up to individuals like Osama bin Laden, saying, we're never going to rest until the Palestine issue is resolved and it's all about the Arab Palestinian refugees. That itself has created this fallacious imagery that has fueled the agenda. And the fact of the matter is that the Arab world has continued to fund this in the tone of billions, because for them, this goes back again to my earlier point about 1948, 1949, had they the kind of positive, or the so-called agreement, not written agreement, but the understanding was between UNRWA and the Arab world. UNRWA said, we need money. The Arab world said, we'll take care of you so long as the refugee problem is going to be your problem, not ours. So it gave them an out in the sense that they took no responsibility whatsoever for the reality post-1948, 1949. And as a result of that, that's why no Arab country, with the exception of Jordan, and there were some parts of Lebanon before the Arab Spring, that ever gave the Palestinians citizenship to maintain and sustain them in refugee status in order to put the blame on Israel. Israel created the problem. It's Israel's responsibility in conjunction with the West to solve the problem. And that was by design.
But things are changing now. We see, for example, given the Iranian threat, the chaos that has been brought to Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Iran's march to the sea, as it were, also its support for the Houthis and its support for Hamas and Hezbollah. All of this is changing some of the relationships, for example, with some of the Gulf countries as it relates to Israel. Is that reflected, do you think, in how going forward some Arab states will look at this 70-year issue and perhaps take another look at the situation on the ground?
I think it already has. I mean, and I think to your point, and you're right, the Middle East has changed and evolved. And I think, and I will go back to the beginning of the eruption of the Arab Spring, where you had real individuals fleeing for their lives. And actually, interestingly enough, going back to Syria early on, there were individuals fleeing from Syria to the UNRWA offices in Lebanon. And UNRWA said, we can't take care of you, because, we need more money. And so there is a sense of a gold standard of refugee status, which are the Arab Palestinians, and then the rest. And I think that as a result of how the Middle East is evolving and changing, and related to all the more real conflicts that are happening in the region as it relates to ISIS and the Houthis and everything else that you've described correctly, you're seeing a kind of a reality check as far as, are the Palestinians really the number one issue in the region? And even though they have been sold as an evergreen issue, it has really caused people to wake up and say, we're hurting, but really you're living in a decent lifestyle. You have homes, you have an educational system, you have Wi-Fi, you have access to the West, and these are things, despite maintaining their refugee status, it's really more of an imagery that has gone on from generation to generation, but continues to perpetuate the problem without any kind of end. But I think the fact that the Arab world, in general, not only on UNRWA monies, has not been donating as they were to the Palestinian Authority, and Abbas himself has complained about that, I think has taken effect, given the fact that there is actually a new reality to look at, in the sense that, as we know, we have Israel today with newer and better ties with the Saudis, with the Gulf, for sure. Now you're seeing Israelis being allowed to go to Dubai. The fact that there is more normalized ties between Israel and the Arab world is really taking an effect and is really shined a light about the fallacies going on within the Palestinian Authority's larger architecture and within UNRWA, and by extension, what exactly are the Palestinian refugees and what is actually happening in that population.
But it's interesting that here you have the contradiction in terms, and perhaps this really explains so much of the lack of movement in terms of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, where the Palestinians believe, and you've just stated it with the UNRWA case, they believe as if the world hasn't changed, that this might as well be 1955 or 75. 170 countries vote to continue the mandate. You go to the Human Rights Council, you go to UNESCO, the World Heritage Committee, wherever you look in the UN system, for a variety of reasons, they continue to have these votes and feel that the international wind is at their back and have had no incentive to come to a table. Why would they go to the table when they have all of this international support? And yet, outside the UN, things really are changing, and changing rapidly on the ground. I'm not asking a rhetorical question here, but do you think it's that we're coming to a juncture at some point here where that reality, kind of the rubber meets the road situation, where the situation tips in the other direction?
Potentially, but to your point, I mean, there is the United Nations, as you and I know, is an island, and mostly I would say more like a coffee pot, is putting out a lot of smoke. But even though the reality on the ground is changing, there is still a belief. The anti-Israel animus is a religion within the United Nations, and the Palestinian cause, despite the fact that there has been a great deal of a breaking down of this orthodoxy, still the majority. I remember that about 2-3 years ago, I was in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council, and every country around the room went without any change or any kind of remorse, saying that the root cause of the problem resorts with the occupation and the existence of Arab Palestinian refugees. And so this narrative has been sold, and to the success story of the Palestinians. I mean, really, even though you are seeing, this beginning of a crumbling of the narrative, the only place where the Palestinians and Mahmoud Abbas and company get a forum, and you see it every year during their address, is through these international bodies, and in particular the United Nations. And they've been able to sell that. This goes back to the 2011 platform of UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, by internationalizing the conflict and selling the suffering and selling the fact that we are stateless, and the fact that we are refugees in perpetuity, and the fact that we are only at the hands of the evil Israelis and the Americans. Doesn't matter what administration. But of course, now it's easier to blame President Trump. It's easy to blame Benjamin Netanyahu. There is this, so all of that plays into their propaganda as far as selling the issues. Again, the corruption is at the top, and you'll say, well, we'll clean it up, but the constituency and the growth of refugees is still there. And so those are the so-called facts on the ground, and so they may argue we need to clean up the corruption, but the need is still great. And when you have leaders like the Queen of Jordan, Queen Rania, who is of Palestinian descent, being one of UNRWA spokesmen and putting on parlor meetings in the Arab world and saying, I'm a Palestinian, you need to help UNRWA, give us money. Resolution is not here in Jordan, but we have to solve the problem over there. That resonates within the psyche of the Arab world and within the United Nations.
I just ask one other question, is relates to this, before we close, there has over the last number of years been a move to tell the story of the 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries who were displaced in the period of the late 40s and early 50s, and their story really was not told for a variety of reasons over the years. But in recent years, there really has been an attempt to tell that story. Do you see that narrative, that important historical narrative, now taking its place in the discussion about what actually happened in 1948? Or do you think that so much time has passed that catching up will take a long time?
It's a good question, and it always comes up in the conversation regarding refugees. The Arab Palestinians flatly deny it, in the sense that because by default, what's interesting, from the historical perspective, the fact that Israel comes to fruition as a result, and there is a state, they can say that they're different, and so they deny any kind of wrongdoing as it relates to the Jews from Arab lands. I mean, Jews in Iraq and other places were forced to sign documentation. You can leave here with one suitcase, and you can never come back asking for reparations. So from that perspective, they left under their own volition, and they did no wrong. It doesn't. One could argue, by definition, that UNRWA should be serving those populations as well. But no, this was only devoted to a special case study by design, defined by the Arab world, to make this resonate. And so while it's a beginning to, again, it's adding to the larger narrative, it adds to the richness and the cultural richness of what makes up Israeli society and Jews from the Arab world. And there's been a movement within those communities, Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Iranian Jews, to make a case at the General Assembly that we should also be acknowledged. But because the state of Israel was the positive result of that, they don't get as much airtime, so to speak, or enough. It doesn't resonate enough with the larger world community, because, again, the Palestinians are the only refugees that we need to be caring about. And so it helps, the Israeli case in the sense of showcasing what makes up Israel, but in the world discourse, it doesn't really create enough of a balance or a counterbalance to deal with the Arab Palestinian refugees.
Well, it's certainly a story that needs to be told about being forced out of 10 or 12 countries in a very short period of time, and that story continues. Now I've noticed really an event at the United Nations just a couple of days ago, and there are other events. People are writing about it, and it's an important chapter in the history of the conflict, which unfortunately has taken a while to be told, but nevertheless important that people know about it. Well, Asaf, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm sure this issue the UNRWA issue will continue to be an open one, and I hope we'll have another opportunity in the future to continue the discussion.
Thank you as always, Dan. Much appreciate the hospitality, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I do hope to continue the conversation. And I agree with you that the story needs to be told vis-a-vis Jews from Arab lands. It's going to take time, and but this will overshadow it, unfortunately. So I'm sure the story will continue going onward.
Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast today. Please visit our website, b'nai-b'rith.org. Like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. Subscribe on your smartphone through the podcast app for iPhone or through Google Play for Android. And lastly, tell a friend about us. For my guest, Dr. Asaf Romirowsky, I'm Dan Mariashin. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai B'rith International Podcast.